If you've ever struggled with managing a fire on your Oklahoma Joe's offset smoker, dealing with temperature swings, thick white smoke, or constantly chasing that target temperature, then this is the video for you. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different methods you can use on your Oklahoma Joe's offset smoker, and you can pick the one that works best for you. So let's get smoking. Let's kick things off with what I call the Franklin method, because barbecue legend Aaron Franklin really popularized it in his books and videos. Or you could call it the fuel control method, because it's all about maximizing airflow and managing the fuel as the main variable you need to control. Here's how it works. With the Franklin method, you keep your dampers and firebox door wide open for maximum airflow. If you have a newer model Oklahoma Joe's offset that doesn't have a firebox door, it just has a ashtray, then you can just remove it halfway or remove it entirely to provide maximum airflow. This ensures that the fire is always burning hot and producing the cleanest smoke flavors possible. To control the temperatures with this method, you maintain a small hot fire and add splits of wood whenever the last split is about to die out. To start the fire with this method, I like to use a fire basket because it concentrates the fire in one area, provides airflow all around the wood splits, and it just makes fire management a little bit easier. But you could use a grate, a single grate on the bottom of the firebox, or 2 grates on an angle in a V shape. I pour some charcoal into the basket. It can be lump or briquette. It doesn't really matter that much. Oklahoma Joe's has some excellent charcoal that I'd highly recommend trying out. I just ran out of it, so I'm using the cheapest stuff I could find at the hardware store. And then I throw some splits on top of it, light them with my charcoal lighter. The size of the splits doesn't really matter at this point because we're just preheating the smoker. Now let the smoker preheat around an hour until the temperature comes down to your target temperature, whether that's 275 or 300, whatever you're shooting for. With this method, both the Oklahoma Joe's Highland and Longhorn like to run around 250 or higher. If you want a lower temperature, let's say 225, it is possible, but you'll have to cut your splits really small and maintain a little fire, which is a lot more challenging. So when I'm using this method and just burning mainly splits, I usually just shoot for 275 to 300 because that's what these smokers like to cook at. Like I said before, your firebox door or ashtray should be fully open. Next, I set up my wired temperature probe. I used to place it right at grate level here with these little clips that come with most wired probes, but I found that it gave me a temperature reading that was lower than the temperature my meat was actually cooking at. So I switched to putting the probe in foil and pointing it up a little bit in the cook chamber so that it's more in line with the top of my meat. This gives a better indication of the actual temperature the meat is cooking at because offset smokers cook from the top down. That being said, if you have some sort of baffle plate setup that's forcing the air down when it comes out of the firebox, then you'll want to put the temperature probe at grate level or even below it in the direction that the heat is coming from. The dome thermometer is okay to use in a pinch, but just be aware that it's going to run around 25 to 50 degrees hotter than the actual temperature your meat is cooking at, closer to grate level. So if my dome thermometer is around 300 degrees, that tells me the meat is cooking at somewhere between 270 to 275. Now, I have a fancy thermometer I use for barbecue competitions, but any wired thermometer will do the job. Oklahoma Joe's has this wired thermometer that is really inexpensive, and it does the job just fine. Now, a lot of people struggle with this method, but here's the secret. You want to use small wood splits and supplement with charcoal. I like to use alligator loppers to quickly cut my wood to size because they're really safe. I used to use a miter saw to cut splits, but I had one too many near misses, so I switched to loppers, which are much safer. You want splits that are roughly 6 to 8 inches long by around 2 to 3 inches wide. Something like this is fine. You could even go a little bit smaller. Smaller splits mean more control, but you'll end up adding them more frequently, so it's kind of a balance. Now I place my splits on the firebox to preheat them so they'll catch faster. This will fix most of your issues if you have wood that has too high of a moisture content. It won't fix green wood, i.e. wood that has a moisture content of 30% or higher. If your wood is really green, it's new, it's not seasoned or kiln dried, then one potential fix you could do is you could put it inside the firebox underneath the fire basket or right next to it to kind of accelerate the drying, or you could put it in the cook chamber to dry it out faster. And then once it's dried out, you can start using it on the fire. But if you do use green wood, it's going to start hissing. You'll see a lot of steam coming off of it in the firebox, and it's going to smolder, and it's going to create some pretty bitter and acrid flavors. So make your life easier by making sure you have seasoned wood with a moisture content of around 10 to 20%. When the temperature starts flatlining and dipping below my target temp, that's when it's time to add more fuel. I'll know that it's the right time because the previous split will look like it's almost burnt out and the temperatures are starting to drop down. At this point, I'll add a very small preheated split to the fire along with a handful of charcoal. The charcoal is optional. It just helps keep your temperatures steadier. Now, if your temps start to spike after you add a split, maybe you got your timing wrong or you added a split that's too big, You can push your fire to the far side of the firebox to cool things down, or you could push the splits of wood together to decrease the amount of air that's getting to them, and that will cause them to burn at a lower temperature. Another thing you could do is you could burp the firebox by opening the lid and letting some of that heat out. It'll also cause the fire to burn faster. The fuel will burn down a little bit. Then when you close the lid, it will hit your target temperature again.
Another thing you can do to help maintain lower and steadier temperatures is using a blocking log or water pan. A log next to the firebox will block some of the radiant heat from the fire, so it's useful in a pinch, but a water pan is much more effective because water has a very high thermal capacity and absorbs an enormous amount of energy from the firebox. This means you can run a hotter, healthier fire while still getting lower chamber temps, and it provides more temperature stability and humidity. Just make sure it's a few inches away from the firebox, otherwise all that heat is going to get forced down under the meat. Another thing you could do is put a steel water pan in the firebox itself and continually refill it as it boils off. This really suppresses the temperatures a lot more than just adding a water pan in the cook chamber, and it adds a lot of humidity, but it's a little bit more of a pain because you need to refill it constantly as it boils off. There's also a lot of mods you can look into. Extending the stack might give you better airflow and more consistent temperatures. Dropping the stack with a cake pan may give you more even chamber temperatures. A baffle plate can help reduce the hot spot by the firebox and giving you more cooking area, but sacrificing the top-down rendering that offsets are known for. I've done a lot of videos on mods on the Oklahoma Joe's YouTube channel, as well as my own channel, Smoke Trails BBQ, and there's entire communities on Facebook dedicated to mods, so have fun with it. There's a lot of things to experiment with to find out what works for you.
Benefit of the Franklin method is you'll get really clean, thin blue smoke and pristine smoke flavor, no bitter, thick white smoke, but the downside is it's time consuming. You'll need to babysit the fire constantly, adding wood every 10 to 15 minutes, and you'll need to adjust the amount of fuel input to keep temperatures stable. So if you just love the art of fire management, or you want to burn sticks on your stick burner, then this is the method for you. The downside is it's a little bit less convenient, but the upside is you'll get really clean flavors and you'll be able to burn all wood. I like to personally supplement it with a little bit of charcoal though. But what if you want maximum convenience? Well, this is when you'd use the charcoal method. This method involves using a lot of charcoal and controlling the temperatures by carefully restricting airflow so it burns slowly over time. Here's how it works. You'll fill a fire basket with charcoal and add a few wood chunks interspersed throughout it for smoke flavor. Then light one corner of the basket so the charcoal slowly burns and lights the unlit charcoal over time, kind of like a fuse. Then with the vents wide open, you let the smoker come up to around 25 degrees below your target temperature. Let's say 225 if you're aiming for 250. Then close the firebox door and the dampers almost fully. And then for the next 10 minutes, adjust them by opening or closing them really slightly until you get to your target temperature and that temperature is locked in. If your temps get too high, then you can shut the dampers down to bring down the temperature. If they get too low, you can open them up a little bit to increase the temperature. And eventually you'll dial in a sweet spot where you can get really stable temperatures for hours and you don't really need to touch the smoker that much. Some things that are optional but will really help with this method is ensuring your smoker is tightly sealed. Oklahoma Joe's sells extra gaskets and door latches and other things you can use to ensure a tight seal. You can also seal everything with high temperature sealant. The tighter everything is sealed, the more control you'll have and the longer burn times you'll have. You can also get an electric blower fan and hook this up to your air inlet. That's an easy way to maintain temperatures using this method. Or if you want a more analog method, you could try something like this Tip Top Temp, which is kind of an obscure barbecue tool, but it uses a bimetal coil to automatically control how much heat it's allowing out of the stack of the smoker. So you set it, and then when it senses that there's too much heat coming out of the stack, then it'll close down automatically. And if the temperature gets too cold, then it'll open up a little bit more, and that will create more draft and suck more air into the firebox, which increases the temperature. Temperature goes up, this thing shuts down again, and so on. So there's a couple of options if you don't want to be manually controlling how much airflow is getting into your smoker. Now, a variation of this method is where you fill up the fire basket maybe a quarter full with charcoal instead of all the way. You light one corner, and then over time, maybe every 30 minutes to an hour, you'll add a chunk of wood and some more charcoal. But again, your vents are almost all the way closed and you're restricting airflow and allowing that charcoal to burn the unlit charcoal on the other side of the firebox, and that's what's maintaining your steady temperatures. Now, the benefit of the charcoal method method is pretty obvious. It's much more convenient. You're not outside all day tending the fire. You can just adjust your dampers and then go away for an hour or two and do some chores, and the temperatures will remain relatively steady. The downside is any wood chunks you add to the fire basket will likely smolder and create kind of heavier white smoke that can produce some bitter and acrid off flavors. So the solution to this is be really conservative with how much wood you add. Don't add a lot of wood chunks and you should be fine. But another downside with this method is you're not getting a lot of convection or airflow in the cook chamber that is really good for drying up the bark on things like ribs or rendering the fat cap on brisket, which is the most important thing to me. I want a really well rendered fat cap on my brisket. And with this method, you're running your offset smoker more like an oven. The air is more stagnant, it's not moving as fast, and it's not kind of air frying that brisket fat cap. So there are some disadvantages, but if you're looking for something that has more of a middle ground between convenience and clean smoke flavor and a high degree of convection that's going to render your fat caps, then that's where you want to look at the hybrid method. The hybrid method is the one I use most often on my Oklahoma Joe's offsets. It gives me the best of both worlds. It gives me consistent temperature control with clean smoke flavor, and I can use mostly wood splits, which is what I like to burn instead of charcoal. Here's how it works. You start with a charcoal base and add small splits, just like with the Franklin method. But with this method, you open and close the firebox door or damper a little bit at a time to maintain temperatures. The goal is to have a constantly burning fire, but limit the airflow so it burns slower to achieve more stable temperatures, and you add fuel less frequently. The beauty of this method is balance. You get the stability of the charcoal with the subtle clean smoke from the constantly burning wood. You get to mainly use wood splits, and instead of adding fuel every 10 to 15 minutes with something like the Franklin method where it's wide open airflow, you might be adding wood every 20 to 25 to even 30 minutes if you can really dial it in. And most importantly for me, I still get that high degree of convection that renders the fat caps on my brisket and gives me the nice bark that I'm looking for. Now you can also use a combination of these methods during a particular cook. For example, I seasoned these baby back ribs with some Smoke Trails BBQ Let's Gow general purpose rub, then a layer of Oklahoma Joe's Nashville hot rub, smoked them on my Longhorn at 275 degrees for 2 hours until the bark was set and they had some nice color. I used the Franklin method here with maximum airflow, firebox door, and the exhaust damper wide open, and I just controlled the temperatures with the fuel that I added to get the cleanest smoke flavor and bark possible. Then I wrapped the ribs in foil and switched to the hybrid method. I didn't really care about over smoking my meat at this point because everything's wrapped, so I closed down my inlet damper and exhaust damper to make it operate more like an oven, and I added wood and charcoal every 20 minutes or so, a little bit less frequently than using the wide open method. 1.5 hours later, I'm checking my ribs for tenderness and they're perfect, so I unwrapped them, I sauced them, and I tacked up the sauce for 30 minutes using the wide open Franklin method to get some cleaner smoke flavors. These ribs were perfectly cooked, juicy, and they had a nice clean smoke flavor, which is what I'm looking for. But I'm interested to hear what you guys think. What method do you use on your Oklahoma Joe's offset smoker? Let me know in the comment section below, and until next time, happy smoking.